Ukraine strikes Russian infrastructure. Escalation on Independence Day. Ukraine's Independence Day this year was marked not only by celebration, but by a dramatic escalation in its war with Russia. In one of the boldest operations of the conflict so far, Ukrainian drones struck deep into Russian territory, targeting infrastructure that is critical to Moscow's war machine. The most dangerous attack came against the Kursk nuclear power plant. The strike forced one of the reactors offline, cutting its output in half. Russian officials were quick to stress there was no radiation leak, but the symbolism was clear. Ukraine had demonstrated both its reach and its willingness to put one of Russia's most sensitive facilities under direct pressure. Almost simultaneously, another set of drones ignited a massive fire at the Ust-Luga fuel terminal, a key hub for Russian energy exports on the Baltic Sea. Flames consumed the site, sending thick smoke into the sky. For Moscow, this was more than an embarrassment. It was a direct strike against one of the financial lifelines funding its war effort. The campaign didn't stop there. In Syzran, drones slammed into fuel depots and other sites, injuring civilians and underscoring the human toll when military and civilian infrastructure overlap. But Ukraine's Independence Day message wasn't only about energy and logistics. Reports confirm that Kyiv authorized precision strikes on Russian military officials tied to the Bucha massacre, the 2022 atrocity that still hangs heavy over this war. The attack caused further damage in Kursk, but its real purpose was symbolic: retribution for crimes that shocked the world. Russia's answer was immediate. Within hours, waves of drones and missiles rained down on Ukrainian cities, testing Kyiv's air defenses and punishing civilian areas in return. The cycle of escalation is accelerating. Ukraine strikes deeper into Russia. Russia retaliates harder against Ukraine. The pattern is clear. This is no longer just a war fought along the front lines. Energy hubs, nuclear facilities, and symbolic targets are now part of the battlefield. Each strike raises the stakes. Each response increases the risks of miscalculation. Ukraine's Independence Day offensive shows its determination to weaken Russia wherever it can. But it also shows that this war is sliding further into a dangerous new phase, where the fight is not only for territory, but for the infrastructure and symbols that sustain nations at war. Massive Russian attack on Kyiv, hundreds of drones, dozens of missiles. Kyiv has endured one of the most devastating attacks of the war. Overnight, Russian forces launched a barrage of nearly 600 drones and 30 missiles against Ukraine's capital in a single coordinated strike. The sky was alive with fire as Ukrainian air defense systems scrambled to intercept wave after wave. Despite a high interception rate, the sheer volume of weapons overwhelmed defenses. Explosions echoed across the city. Fires lit the night sky. By morning, at least 23 people were dead, including 4 children. Dozens more were injured. The attacks were not limited to military targets. The EU mission and the British Council in Kyiv suffered damage, striking directly at international institutions operating in Ukraine. Russia insists its strikes are aimed at infrastructure, but the images tell another story. Apartment blocks torn open, offices gutted, civilians buried under rubble. The symbolism of the attack is just as striking as the destruction. Firing 600 drones in one night sends a clear message. Russia's ability to mass-produce cheap unmanned systems is changing the tempo of the war. For Ukraine, the challenge is not whether it can intercept, but whether it can endure a strategy designed to overwhelm by sheer volume. The response from Europe was swift. Leaders across the EU condemned the strike, calling it barbaric and urging renewed diplomacy to prevent further escalation. Yet words alone may not be enough. As the war grinds on, Ukraine is asking for more advanced air defenses, more ammunition, and greater commitments from its allies. For Kyiv's citizens, the night was a terrifying reminder that even after 2.5 years of war, the scale of destruction can still grow. For Ukraine's allies, it was a test of resolve, and for Russia, it was a demonstration, proof that its strategy of attrition is far from over. The war is no longer just about front lines in the east. It is about the ability of Ukraine to survive massive citywide strikes designed to terrorize its population and cripple its institutions. What happened in Kyiv is a glimpse of the future of warfare. Skies filled with swarms of drones, precision missiles striking in unison, and the thin line of air defenses standing between survival and catastrophe. Europe calls for stricter measures against Russia. Merz pushes allies. Europe is facing a critical moment in its response to Russia's war on Ukraine. This week, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz called on allied nations to take stronger action, warning that unless Russia is cut off from the economic resources fueling its war, the conflict will drag on indefinitely. His message was blunt. It's not enough to supply Ukraine with weapons and aid. The West must ensure Russia can no longer sustain its war effort. Merz's remarks come as Moscow claims momentum on the battlefield. Russian forces have intensified their offensive across eastern Ukraine, pressing to capitalize on what they describe as an attritional advantage. Drone and missile strikes on Ukrainian cities continue, while ground assaults push against exhausted Ukrainian defenses. The contrast is stark. On one side, Europe's largest economy is urging a total economic squeeze, tighter sanctions, stricter enforcement, and a coalition effort to block Russia's access to global markets. On the other side, Russia is signaling that despite years of sanctions, it can still adapt, still trade, and still fight. For Ukraine, this is a race against time. Its survival depends not only on weapons delivered to the front, but on whether Europe and the United States can close the gaps in sanctions that allow Russia to keep financing its war. Oil exports, access to technology, and quiet partnerships with states willing to look the other way all remain lifelines for Moscow. Merz's warning highlights a deeper truth. Wars of attrition aren't decided only by soldiers on the battlefield. They are decided by which side can sustain the cost longer. By that measure, Europe is beginning to ask whether it has done enough to cut off Russia's war chest. For Ukraine, the stakes are existential. For Europe, the question is one of credibility. If sanctions and restrictions fail to stop Russia's advance, then words of support will ring hollow. This is a moment of decision, whether Europe can match its rhetoric with actions strong enough to truly change the course of the war. Danish-US diplomatic clash over Greenland. EU eyes Moldova. This week, a quiet corner of the Arctic set off a storm in European diplomacy. Denmark summoned the U.S. chargé d'affaires after uncovering alleged attempts, linked to Trump affiliates, to influence the political status of Greenland. While Greenland is an autonomous territory, it remains part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Washington has long viewed the island as strategically vital, sitting between North America and Europe, and home to the U.S. Thule Air Base. The revelations triggered immediate pushback in Copenhagen. Danish officials stressed that Greenland's status is not up for negotiation, and that any foreign interference is unacceptable. The move highlights Europe's growing concern that Arctic politics, once distant, are becoming an arena for great power rivalry. For the United States, Greenland is more than a frozen island. It's a keystone of missile defense, Arctic shipping routes, and access to rare earth resources. For Denmark and the European Union, it's a matter of sovereignty. The allegations that political operatives may be testing ways to loosen Copenhagen's grip struck a nerve and raised fears of wider interference. At the same time, European leaders traveled to Moldova, signaling support for its bid to join the EU. Their visit focused not only on economic partnership, but also on protecting Moldova from the very thing Denmark fears: election interference and outside manipulation. Sandwiched between Ukraine and Romania, Moldova has long been vulnerable to Russian influence operations. The EU's message was clear: Moldova's future should be decided in Chisinau, not in Moscow. Taken together, these developments underscore a deeper trend. From the Arctic to Eastern Europe, questions of sovereignty, influence, and interference are no longer isolated events. They are becoming a continental challenge. Denmark's defense of Greenland and Europe's outreach to Moldova are part of the same struggle, ensuring that borders, territories, and democratic decisions aren't rewritten by outside powers. And as the US, Russia, and Europe all maneuver for influence, small states and territories like Greenland and Moldova are increasingly caught at the heart of global competition. Ukraine unveils new security strategy, set POW exchange, marks diplomatic breakthrough. In Kyiv, Ukraine's leadership has outlined a new three-tiered security strategy, a plan designed to guide the country through the next phase of the war and prepare for the years ahead. The first tier focuses on bolstering military resilience. This means modernizing Ukraine's defenses, accelerating weapons production at home, and ensuring supply lines from allies remain steady. With Russian strikes intensifying, the emphasis is on sustaining the fight not just for months, but for the long haul. The second tier is about NATO alignment. Ukraine's government is making clear that its ultimate security guarantee lies in integration with the Transatlantic Alliance. Steps toward interoperability, training, doctrine, and joint planning are being prioritized to make Ukraine's military function as closely as possible to NATO standards, even before full membership is granted. The third tier targets Russia's economic lifelines. Kyiv is pressing its allies to tighten sanctions, closing loopholes that still allow Moscow to fund its war effort, and targeting industries that keep its military machine running. The goal is to weaken Russia's capacity to fight not only on the battlefield, but in the global market. At the same time this strategy was unveiled, diplomacy also made a rare breakthrough. A prisoner exchange saw 146 prisoners of war from each side swapped. For the families of those captured, it was a moment of relief in a war defined by loss. For Kyiv, it demonstrated that even in the midst of brutal combat, negotiation channels remain open. Together, these moves reflect the dual reality of Ukraine's struggle. On one hand, a long-term strategy to secure the nation's survival through strength, alliances, and pressure on Russia. On the other, the human side of diplomacy, where even small agreements, like exchanging prisoners, carry enormous symbolic weight. Ukraine's message is clear. It is not only fighting for survival today, but laying the groundwork for a future where its security is anchored in NATO, its economy aligned with Europe, and its sovereignty defended by both strength and diplomacy. Stay informed on the world's shifting power. Subscribe to the Watchtower Report, where strategy meets reality.